Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of The New Agora. I'm Athenianos,
I'm Matthew Brown.
and today we have a very special guest. Matthew, I think you would like to introduce him.
Yeah, absolutely. Today we're joined by Jonathan Hearn. He's a professor in political and historical sociology. You mentioned earlier that you did a PhD in anthropology and you say ethnography? Was it?
Well, I'm an
That's
ethnographer, but it was in
ethnography. Okay,
anthropology. Yeah.
nice, lovely. You've been with the University of Edinburgh since 1998, as you've
Mhm.
just told us. And you're also, I noticed in your book, president of the Association for the Study of Ethnicity and Nationalism,
Mhm.
and also a founding member of Edinburgh Academics for Academic Freedom, if I've got that correct.
Yep.
And today we're going to be talking about your new book that you've just published, The Domestication of Competition.
You missed one important
Yeah.
biographical detail.
What's that?
He's a Texan.
Yes, he is a Texan.
Yes, I am.
So what I would like to start by reading just a couple of short quotes
Mhm.
from the book.
Mhm.
Can we give the title first?
Yeah, I just said the title.
Oh, okay.
The idea of the domestication of competition is to be understood as a way of understanding how the role of competition in human social life has changed over the centuries. This domesticated kind of competition brings benefits as a spur to achievement and an alternative to more brutal forms of conflict. It can and does become dysfunctional and pathological. It is a perennial aspect of social relations, and that is why we need a realistic understanding of competition so we can bring out its benefits and limit its injuries.
Mhm.
Following from that, I'd like you to sort of introduce the book in your own terms. Tell us why you chose to publish the book now. I noticed at the beginning you said that it has been a long time
Mhm.
coming in the process. So, yeah, if you could explore that for us, that'd be great.
Yeah. Well, I'll start with why now. I mean, the most academic books are not, immediate responses to what's happening in the news this year. It's, they take a long time. And this is, I had in my research on theories of power in the social sciences, one of my central concerns has always been how do we understand how modern liberal forms of society achieve legitimacy, in the eyes of its citizens, of its members of society, when there is a kind of built-in distrust of authority and government. It's kind of in with the bricks with that kind of system. So I've always been particularly interested in the question of how does modern liberal society achieve authority and legitimacy, and that got me when I was writing on a book several years ago called Theorizing Power about that. It got me thinking about this question and the role of competition in doing some of that legitimation work in these kinds of societies. And I had a mid-career fellowship in 2013, 2014 from the Independent Social Research Foundation, which gave me a period of time to just concentrate on this question and do a lot of reading. And it, in the short run, it led to various articles, but I always had the idea that I'd write a book about it when I had time to, sit down and write it. And luckily, a pandemic helped me do that. So
there's plenty of time to do that.
Plenty of time to do that, yeah. And a sabbatical, I have to say.
Okay, excellent. You made a few important distinctions at the beginning of the book. You identified three premises that sit behind your argument, one being power, being a primary driver of human action, one being those who are doing that are actors or agents. I think you prefer the term actors over agents, and the concept of evolution, like social evolution. Could you talk to us more about the importance of those three concepts behind your thesis?
Yeah, I mean, those are, in some level, that's me kind of summing up my general theoretical equipment that I've arrived at over many years of working on stuff. But yes, I mean, the idea is, first off, that, in my view, understanding society in general is generally understanding forms of managing power relationships between human beings. I mean, that's basically what society is a way of organizing the potential collective power of the group in a certain way that, again, achieves some sort of legitimacy, endures, stands up. And and I'm very interested in this question of how, on the one hand, we are interested in power to do things. We want to have just as agents, we all want to be able to achieve things in our lives, and as collectivities, we want to be able to do things. But as society becomes more complex, the power to entails also more and more power over. In other words, the social forms that we organize ourselves through involve hierarchy and chains of command. And so one of the great puzzles is what's the tolerance level for that level of power over, and the way that you control it in terms of when it becomes too oppressive, right? So that kind of power dynamic, I think, is really central to understanding any kind of society or any kind of complex organization within society. It helps explain families even,
Sure.
And then actors, without going into too much detail, there is a kind of tension in the study of power between attributing power to social structures that have, that do kind of shape and direct our lives and put constraints on us. But my claim, and many of the people who study power say, but nonetheless, somehow you have to be able to trace the concept of power down to social actors, people who actually exert power, achieve ends, and in some cases, do that by subordinating other people, or perhaps willingly, perhaps unwillingly. And so the part of the point there is simply that we cannot understand power and how it works in society without understanding the agents or actors through which it operates. And the thing about society becoming larger and more complex over human history is that we learn ways to form collective actors that can do things that individuals rarely can. So much of the study of power in modern society is not the study of individuals, great men, as the saying used to go, but it's the study of large corporate actors like companies, corporations, states, political parties,
social movements.
Social movements.
Yeah.
Although, social movements are an interesting case in that they're often on the cusp of this actorhood, in that when they're very spontaneous in reactions to immediate, circumstances, individuals come together and act together, but they fall apart and dissolve very quickly unless the movement forms more formal organizations that are corporate actors in the other sense that I'm talking about. And that's, in the social movement literature, that's a basic issue of the kind of the spontaneous movement versus what are called social movement organizations that become very kind of routinized and kind of sustain certain movements. And that's power and actors. And then, without putting too fine a point on it, the idea is that this dynamic of competition and actorhood, as there are various kinds of actors, trying to exert themselves and achieve things, is one of the main drivers of social change. So it's not that other things aren't important, like demographic growth or technological change. There are lots of things that affect social change, but I'm arguing that one of the reasons the concept of evolution is applicable to social change, and we're not talking about biological evolution, we're talking about social evolution, is precisely because it has this dynamic of entities, corporate actors, in competition with each other and driving each other on towards, different forms.
And so I have just a question about that, because you said that the competitive nature, kind of that striving for greater power, drives the social change. But where do you think that competitive nature stems from? Is it something that is institutional in society, or is it something inherent in our own personalities as humans? We have competitive nature, or is it rather the environment that we are put in that enables us or shapes us in a certain way to be competitive?
Yeah. I'm distrustful, suspicious of any attempt to claim a kind of competitive instinct in human beings, just because I think competition is too complex a behavior to be, genetically determined. Obviously, we have their kind of fight or flight instincts, and there are various kinds of pretty basic hardwired into us behaviors. But I define competition as rivalry over some limited good, and that's a very old definition. It goes back to the 16th century or 17th century, and that's not an instinct or a part of human nature. That's a kind of situation. So, in a situation where there is, we're not here competing to breathe air.
Right.
It's freely available. It's not a limited good, but we might compete for speaking time or something if we had big egos or whatever. But
we'll get there.
And that's part of the point of the title of the book, Domestication of Competition, is precisely that. The point is that at a certain point in human history, the way that we compete with each other becomes highly institutionalized, highly formalized, very kind of rule governed in political, economic, cultural spheres, and that the ensuing competition is enabled or an effect of that institutional change. It's not just human competitiveness, from somewhere deep in our genes expressing itself.
So is it correct to say that essentially what you're saying is that we started in this Hobbesian world where there's no institutional structure and we're all just competing for these limited goods out there. But then we created institutions that not just through political institutions but also societal institutions that allowed us, or that caused us to be competitive in a quote unquote civil
civil way.
In a civil way.
The argument is very much about reining in violent competition and replacing it with more civil forms of competition. I tend to agree with Max Weber that competition is peaceful conflict, basically. Right. The foundation is not terribly Hobbesian in the sense that I think if you go back in human history, human beings were never absolutely isolated individuals in competition with each other. From our primate origins, we were parts of families and bands, and the way we do that has changed from our primate ancestors. But there's built-in cooperation and into the species and our instincts, as well as capacity for competition. And that's one of the basic points here is that people often talk in a critical way of we hate competition, it ruins us, let's have cooperation. But we often find that competition is the driver of cooperation.
I see.
Strong cooperation happens in groups that are in competition with other groups, right? And that's obviously part of our primate history, but I'm saying that principle is kind of bedded in and elaborated in a lot of ways.
So competition does not mean every man for themselves, but rather it's a driver of collaboration and cooperation with others.
Yeah, and when you harness it in the way I'm talking about, it the kind of creative dynamism that comes with competition can be unleashed and amplified without the kind of cost of society wiping each other out. I don't want to be, we still live in an international world where states are in some cases kind of zero-sum struggles with each other. There's real, brutal competition still with us. But the book is very much about how the liberal form of society that's generally contained within liberal democratic state regimes manages to harness this energy and cultivate it to a kind of collective purpose. There's a big difference between having to achieve legitimacy by having a central authority lay down what's true and what we believe and squash on anybody who doesn't agree with it, versus having a system where people are invited to constantly put forth new proposals, new interpretations, new claims on truth, but without killing each other. They find ways to kind of winnow out and select, amongst those truth claims.
Mm.
And I'm saying that's a kind of, that will make this kind of society more ideologically productive, and ideological not in the kind of negative political sense, but in just the general sense of ideation evolving. Yeah.
Well, I found the chapter on from the church to the universities like particularly fascinating, very relevant. And on the point you said there a second ago about the example that you used was the breakdown of this idea of a shared truth that we're seeking after, right? And all that there's kind of like the American political project, right? Like you have a shared, there was that idea of we're Americans first and foremost before any of the political or ideological stuff. Within the university community, you identified there's been this breakdown of that idea that there's this truth that we're all in pursuit of, because there's this relativistic strand. I think you mentioned the kind of the lived experience argument, very subjective way of putting forward truth claims. I had a question I was ramping up to, and I've lost the train of thought. Could you provide us with some other examples from the other domains you looked at of where that a similar kind of breakdown can happen, where because we spoke about the positive and the negative aspects of competition. Can you give some more examples of the negative aspects of it?
I mean, classically, I'll sort of preface this by saying, one of the core arguments is that, I look at the military sphere, the economic sphere, the political sphere, and then the kind of cultural, ideological sphere, what do you want to call that? And one of the basic premises is that the modern nation state is based on bringing all the different military powers that are dispersed in feudal society and constantly at war with each other, and kind of low-level warfare was characteristic of that kind of society, under the aegis of the civil state. And so you end up with a single military system that is subordinate to the state. That sort of, in a funny way, eliminating military competition within your national sphere is one of the things that enables the proliferation of competition in these other spheres, right? And so in economic sphere, the obvious thing that happens in modern capitalist market-based economies is that there is a chronic tendency towards monopoly, towards economic power concentrating in the hands of people who won the competition and can then reproduce that dominant position. So one of my arguments is that if you allow the society to get to the point where both you have big, corporate economic actors, huge insurance companies, big pharma, or whatever, and people in the wider society have a sense that, there's some people who are just up there with all the money and kind of, permanently, ensconced in that position, others who are struggling to be in the middle class, and still others who are really in precarious, circumstances, that situation will undermine, in people's eyes, the presumption that we're all in the same competitive game of economic competition and to get ahead. And if people feel like I don't have a chance to get ahead, that's a legitimacy problem for the capitalist system. In the political system, we're in a period where there's been kind of remarkable polarization, certainly in the United States, between the Republicans and Democrats, the left and right parties. But, for much of my adult life, if one had a criticism of the American party system, it would have been that the parties are too much like each other, that they converge on a central point, and that central point is influenced by money and lobbying influence, from the wider system that tends to overwrite some of the kind of philosophical differences they might have. So
I've heard that be referred to as the uniparty.
yeah,
This idea that it's not two separate parties, just kind of
just
one
one
doing basically the same thing,
Yeah.
which is why you don't get much
Yeah.
difference in operation when you swap from one to the other.
Yeah. And I think the present situation is dysfunctional in the United States. I think that situation is not good. You actually want a kind of, a situation where parties are in genuine competition with each other and presenting generally different views, but all operating within the same general presumption of, that the game is legitimate, right? Like January 6th in the United States, that's about people saying, not just that, our guy didn't win, but the game is not legitimate altogether. And that's a real crisis. And it's a case of people ceasing to believe in the efficacy of party competition, right? So that's another place where it breaks down. And then you were talking about universities, and yes, I think it's a very complex thing, there are different parallel cultures in the university sphere now around how we make truth claims. I tend to use this term throughout the book or through these chapters about, describing ideological or cultural competition being competition over contending truth claims to the truth. And doing that has a presumption that there is some reality out there that none of us has a perfect grasp on, and that's why we conflict over it and make contending claims. But that game, again, only works if people begin with that presumption that there is some reality about which there is truth, and that we kind of compete to make claims on that. If people start to, take strong, constructionist epistemological views, or like you were suggesting, very strong kind of subjectivism, my moral beliefs are the foundation of what I say is true rather than, what I observe. This tends to weaken the capacity of it to function as a arena of competing truth claims, because people will just talk past each other and just not listen to each other. Because
what's worse, then it breaks down immediately into the unpleasant kind of conflict, where it's about, because if how you see the world is the world to you, and there's nothing anyone can say to you to contradict that, and someone tries to do that, then you're at loggerheads immediately. And so then there's that unproductive conflict rather than productive competition between backing the ideas backwards and forwards.
Absolutely. Sorry.
I wanted to ask a question about legitimacy, because you mentioned that we've in modern society we've kind of the goal of the liberal state is to have the military competition no longer be be a concern, and so you can focus on economic competition
within its territory,
right, within its territory. But I think that, and then this idea, I'm going to attribute to Foucault, though it probably predates him, but this idea that there's power in the system, but you don't know where it's coming from and how it's controlling you, and essentially how to break it in order to maintain that competitiveness. And I think that one of the main difficulties of liberal societies is a lot of people feel that way, like there is this power over them. Particularly, you mentioned the middle class stays stagnant, and there's not a lot of social mobility, even in welfare states like Scandinavian states. You can see that the social mobility is not that high. People who are born in lower class tend to stay lower class. People born in the middle class tend to stay there, and same for the upper class. And so when you have people's perceptions that there's some kind of power over them that's preventing them from really competing,
Mm-hmm.
let's say,
Mm-hmm.
what's the solution to that? How do you solve that, legitimacy crisis in liberal democracy, to say to people, look, no, there is real competition and you can move from lower to higher, because there is anomaly cases where somebody through a Herculean effort goes from, dirt poor to rich, and people point to that and say, see, you can do that. But the response is always, but, this is a singular, or a unique case. The vast majority of people are stuck, and we're not on, we're not playing the same game. So how do you, and I think that question is more prevalent now than it was even, 10 years ago, let's say. So how do you stop, or how do you solve that crisis?
Well, if I knew how to solve it, I would. But I mean, if I can just preface what I'm saying with, you started with Foucault, and you're right, he has this rather amorphous concept of power where it's kind of everywhere and nowhere at the same time. And it's precisely that kind of conception of power that I'm distancing myself from in that early chapter, where I say, to think about power, we have to attribute it to actors. Otherwise, it just turns into this kind of amorphous thing, right? So the other thing I would say is that my understanding, the way I think about the modern economy, modern capitalism, is not that we're stuck in this choice between let the market rule and have power, or let the state rule, which is, for various reasons, a lot of politics and party alignments. Major parties tend to divide along that line. But the fact of the matter is, the modern capitalist economy and the modern state evolved together. They are symbiotic, and therefore, kind of arguments to the effect of, these things are in some sort of zero-sum struggle, and we need some sort of radical choice, one direction or the other. I don't believe that, and therefore, I don't have any problem with the idea of saying, if the economy is becoming stagnant and kind of permanently stratified, which this has to do with a lot of things. It has to do with globalization. America had fairly high mobility at a certain point, but we just won a big war, and we were the dominant power, and the economy was changing very rapidly, and people were moving from industrial to white collar kind of work. But that sort of played itself out, and since then, in recent decades, it's kind of been much more stagnant, despite remarkable technological innovation and change. So if we end up in this place where it's starting to stagnate and people are not feeling that the system is fair, that's where I would say, well, we need to vote for political parties that will take a more interventionist relationship to this and think seriously about what the minimum standards should be, and how to take areas that are extremely impoverished and invest in them. And there can be lots of ways of doing that. It doesn't just have to be direct aid. It can be, developing local business and all sorts of things through tax incentives. There's lots of things one can do. But it also raises the question of, is not only, do we need to level things up, as Boris Johnson likes to say, but do we need to level things down? Is there a level of having too much wealth and too much power in society? So that's a point where even though I'm happy to, I don't think we have any viable vision of something other than a kind of capitalist economy wedded to a modern welfare state. Generally, I think the state could take a more active role in trying to flatten things out and make sure that the game is generally competitive.
And does that look like, taxes that are more balanced, or that tax the rich a higher percentage? And
yes, I mean, I don't want to, I'm not an economist. I'm happy to defer to, economists about many of the details of this kind of stuff. But yes, I don't have a problem with notions of progressive taxation, and saying that, through taxation or however, the state needs to find ways to guarantee investment in particularly depressed, impoverished areas, and investment that is not just keeping the wolf from the door, but is actually stimulating economic growth, at the ground level.
So ensuring this competition.
Yeah, and it's that part of the effect of an economy where there's a chronic tendency towards monopoly is that you get to points where it's just no longer profitable for the kind of private sector economic actors to put money into certain communities to pursue growth. And so you at some point you have to kind of start moving things around. I mean, there's a place in the end of the book where I kind of mention in passing the Crouch report by the MP Tracy Crouch, who did a study of football in the UK, and was recommending that we need to do things so that small local football teams can get some of the money that's constantly being sucked into the big teams at the top, right? And that's because community football, its value is in terms of things it does for the community. Its value is not simply in creating football stars and huge gobs of money for a few teams. And she's a conservative MP, right? And my argument is that kind of by analogy, and I mean that's true for the system as a whole. That whatever economic argument you make, there are people who will say, whoever succeeds most in the market economy, you have to let them accumulate the wealth because they're the ones who are best equipped to know what to do with it. You shouldn't interfere with that process, against what I'm saying. And that's an argument. But my argument back would be, yes, but if that gets to the point where it starts to undermine regime legitimacy, you've got a bigger problem on your hands.
because the economy is inherently tied to the state, right?
Yes.
That's why it would undermine the state legitimacy.
Yeah. I mean, I don't believe in this idea that it somehow naturally exists. It can't exist without currencies, contracts, all sorts of things that the state provides. That and before the modern state arose, most limited international trade was just chains of rather tenuous contracts between people in different countries trading stuff along routes, but it wasn't nothing like the incredibly dynamic, perhaps too dynamic economy in terms of its kind of ecological impacts was possible.
So on this point of legitimacy still, you're speaking about certain actors who accrue a lot of the wealth, and that alienates a lot of people, makes them suspicious, disenfranchised, and to disengage and to kind of like drop out, lock out, and like you said, not commit their own personal resources to improvement because what's the point, right? You spoke about sort of one of the solutions to this being sort of like progressive taxing or other ways of investing in infrastructure or opportunities. Is one of the ways of dealing with this alienation that people experience that distribution to most stuff in the hands of a few. So there's the Pareto distribution, or Price's law, I think it is. It's like something like the square root of the productive force produces 50% of the output. And so it's like the sun in the solar system has got most of the mass, right? If you take the sun out of the equation, Jupiter's got most of the mass. Take Jupiter out of the equation, and you can do this with like books sold, clothes that you wear. Like it's a.
This is often the 80-40.
That's the one. Yeah, that's the one. Yeah. So how much of this alienation could be remedied, not necessarily by, because my concern is the amount of, because you're talking about getting the balance right between the economy and the state, but so my concern is like how much energy would the state have to put in to the economy to rectify this imbalance if there's this seeming force, right, that isn't necessarily attached, or it's kind of attached to the actors, but the money seems to be moving itself in a kind of way based on what, like with sports, for example, like the football teams, like the money goes where people's attention goes. Like people buy season tickets, football tickets, jerseys, and so that's kind of where the money channels. So how, like, if we're talking about getting this balance right between the state and the economy, there's a concern of how much effort the state's going to have to put in to remedy something that's potentially could take an infinite or an increasing amount of energy, which would then throw off that balance between getting the economy working and the state not being too overbearing. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. I totally. There's a bit of this kind of zero-sum image of, for the state to accumulate the power to do that, it has to suck, power out of the economy and become this.
Well, not so much suck power out of it, but as in to put effort and energies into constraining it in a way. So not necessarily like zero sum abstracting the resources, although that is one of the options. But I don't know. I guess in my head, I have like the economy as this kind of fluid fluid state of affairs, right? And that when that's energetic, right? And so if you're trying to stop or control where certain aspects of it are going, the way I have it in my head is sort of like an orb or a ball of nodes, and you're trying to like hold it in a place, and to do that requires a certain amount of energy, effort, or power, and I guess I'm concerned
It's
of like
a sort of Hayekian argument.
That was a quite remarkable description of the economy.
Well, I guess my concern is like a kind of positive feedback loop, right? Where you're gonna have to keep putting energy into controlling something that is itself.
I guess, I mean,
I'm not sure that makes any sense.
I know what you mean. I mean, I'm not that worried about that, but I guess I would say the problem in the present is precisely that left on its own without some of this intervention, that fluidity is weakening precisely because large swathes of the population have very little access to capital, and small portions of the population have huge access to capital. And
hasn't that always been the case though? Even if you go back like to the aristocracy or feudal societies, you still have a small number of people who have access to all of the resources, and most people who don't have anything. So,
well, yes, although I mean that's the proportion issue, but
sure,
but certainly the modern market economy is much more fluid and has seen much more class mobility and stuff in certain phases. So it's different in that respect, and so I see the argument I'm making as is one of removing blockages to a system that's not flowing to its most highest efficiency. I don't see it as
placing blockages,
or putting this incredible task on the state. Having said that, there's a difference between understanding the state as just something that steals the wealth of private citizens for its own purposes, right? Versus as something that precisely because this modern economy is partly its creation, and it is a democratic state, it has a responsibility for making sure that the thing is functioning properly. Because the economy we're dealing with right now, various things could happen in terms of new technologies and shifts in the geography of where investment is attractive that kind of shifts this and causes some, things, some of this blockages to release. I mean, we have to be realistic. There's a kind of Euro-American centric nature to this argument, right? Sure. In China, the middle class has grown hugely in the last, few decades. I mean, more people have been lifted out of poverty in China than at any other point in history. But so their issues are rather different from ours. But I don't, because I see the state and the capitalist market economy as in this symbiotic relationship. That entails that the state has got to have some sort of role. If I would sort of, by analogy, compare what's happened certainly in the U.S. to a problem of obesity. Parts of the economy are incredibly obese, and others are sort of starving, and that's just not functionally a healthy way to have the economy functioning. But I'm generally sympathetic to the idea of a market economy where there's lots of small and medium scale businesses doing all sorts of things, giving people, livelihoods in all sorts of different ways. I'm not, although I locate myself sort of left of center, I'm not hostile to business.
I didn't get that sense.
Yeah, and I think it's so it's a lot of these issues are kind of just about rebalancing the flow of capital, through the system. And I know you sort of alluded to the football thing. What's wrong with Liverpool, Manchester United, whatever, kind of, being at the top and absorbing all the money. If that's what people are spending their money on, it's freely chosen, right? There's absolute truth to that. But I think at the same time, you will hear people saying, but my club is just struggling to have enough money, get enough bums and seats to hire the few players it needs next. People do have these commitments to these things that are kind of starving on the margin at the same time as they're, people are contradictory at the same time that they're sending all their money towards the big teams.
To go back to that sports analogy, there's a great book and then a movie called Moneyball.
I haven't seen that. Is that the one that Brad Pitt was in?
Brad Pitt, yeah. Basically, it's you have the Yankees who are drowning in money, and then a team like the Oakland A's who have no funding. And there's a great line in the movie when all of their like rookie players, stars, are basically becoming free agents, and so they know they're no longer going to be able to afford these players. And so they're sitting in the room, the GM and all of the scouts, and the guys are all trying to say, oh, we need people who can hit 50 home runs and replace these guys. And then GM, the Brad Pitt, is just like blah 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 blah, and he asks them what's the problem, and they say, we need to replace these guys, and he's like, no. The problem is there's rich teams, there's poor teams, and then there's 50 feet of crap, and then there's us. And anyway, the point is, they develop this whole different strategy to compete with these teams, and they have a great season, but in the end, the Yankees still beat them. So it's this like demoralizing.
Yeah. I mean, part of the reason this analogy of sports and the game comes up here is, because in the concluding chapters, I developed that as I kind of argue that, if you went back to medieval feudal society, the dominant image or metaphor of society was the family, and the king was the father, and there's this idea that what gives society its order and its legitimacy and its structure is this image of it being kind of a familial structure writ large, which creates aristocracies and stuff. But in our post-aristocratic age, the central image is precisely this arena of competition. And the place where we refine that image to its kind of most purified, abstractly purified form is in games, sports, all these kinds of entertainments that we do to ourselves. And part of what I'm saying in the book is that this is a kind of like a deeply, somebody who read the book and was commenting on it recently said it was a sort of fractal-like image of, this image of formalized competition, kind of game-like structure is
ritualistic.
Ritualistic.
You're practicing in all the various little aspects of
yeah.
life.
I mean, it has many of the qualities of classic ritual. There's procedures that have to be followed for the ritual to be legitimate. It's usually has kind of expert practitioners, and very often the study of rituals are understood as dramatizing fundamental things about the society and its social order back to the people who live it, right? And part of what I'm saying is that, on the one hand, there's something, it sounds frivolous to talk so much about games, but I'm saying that actually our modern image of what justice is based on the image of the sport or the game or this rule-governed system of competition, and that's part of why it's central to how we entertain ourselves. Is we are telling ourselves a story about what makes social relations just in this kind of society, what makes them fair.
That's interesting.
And
because why people get so upset when people cheat at games, right? You're watching a game of football, someone handball or offside or something, and people get genuinely they're like, they respond quite impassionately to a violation in the rules. So it's quite interesting.
And it, but it spills over into our political discourse when Partygate was happening here, and conservative members of government were having parties while other people were locked down. The response was, it's one rule for them and another one for us. That's the language that is kind of deeply embedded in how we understand things.
Well, I guess that's what alienates you from the game, right? If you're recognizing this, there is one rule for them and one rule for me, but we seem to be playing the same game.
Yeah.
So what's going on? That increases the likelihood of people opting out, right? Becoming disenfranchised and going, actually, well, no, I don't want any part in the game that we're playing.
Yeah. And, there are parts of society that are kind of de facto opted out. And there's there's two different strategies for opting out. One is to, either go off grid or, engage in kind of a criminal livelihood or whatever. But another way is to be so rich that, the well-being of the country you're in is, you're a global citizen and it's just not your primary concern. Once again, my argument is that, if we want these kind of nation state, political regimes to survive, one has to find ways to put limits on those tendencies.
Well, I also want to come back to the universities quickly on that idea of alienation and putting forward truth claims. One of my concerns is about this, like the idea of belief, right? So if you, true or not, right, that if you believe that the society you're in is systemically, structurally, or whatever it is, skewed against you for whichever of the identity characteristics or domains that argument can be made, that alienation can come about from the mere belief that that's the case, independent of the truth value of that. And that kind of comes back to the relativistic, subjectivist, lived experience kind of arguments, that it's my lived experience that I feel based on my experiences that this society is X, Y, and Z against me from this group. Maybe this isn't within the scope of your book necessarily, but what? Or maybe it is, because I guess that again comes down to in a way, like the unfair competition between ideas, right? Because if you've got this box around you and your lived experience, right, that's like the epitome of one rule for me and another rule for somebody else. So how I mean, if I can just read this little paragraph here. Sorry, I really like this chapter paragraph. Sorry, and it's talking in the context of that breakdown of that shared idea of a truth that we're all kind of aiming at but disagreeing about and having conversations.
Can you give the page number for those listening?
Sure. So 277. So in universities, especially in the social sciences and humanities, this divergence has played out as the increasing polarization between an older, more realist, objectivist, and naturalistic pursuit of true interpretations and a newer preference for social constructivism, subjectivism, and a primary commitment to the moral message of arguments. In the latter case, research can become not so much the pursuit of truth as the pursuit of social justice. Thus, fields of study influenced by identity politics often see the purpose of research and writing as the emancipation of, or at least the struggle on behalf of various identity groups. And this is the bit that I really like. I am not criticizing political struggle as such, which is inevitable and necessary. But to the degree that universities and their various sciences become zero-sum contests over ideological supremacy and institutional turf, rather than collective, ongoing, rule-governed competitions in search of truth, they cease to be either sciences or universities.
Yeah.
I think that I loved that paragraph.
Okay.
I thought it really, really, really nailed what's happening around us at the moment.
Yeah. And that's, I mean, if you read the book, you'll find that, one of the sociologists that has most influenced me is
Which, where can you get the book?
Well, Amazon, you can order it from Cambridge, or you can, I think it's at our local bookstore, but I don't know. For university people, there's an ebook in the library. So,
go and read it.
Yes, please do. Read early, read often. But Max Weber, the German sociologist, is a kind of influence on me, and part of that kind of argument is, in tune with his arguments about to make, the environment of the university, of what academics do, work. You have to have some sort of effort after what he called value freedom, but that whatever our personal moral convictions and values and beliefs, which we all have, we can't, nobody can shed those, right? That you make a distinction between that and what you're doing in the academic arena of scholarship, and that the bottom line is that this is a kind of game which is premised on it's very hard to make it work if you don't think that there is some sort of objective reality that sure. your contending claims to truth are about, but that the issue is how compelling is the evidence and the structure of the argument that you present, how well formulated are the basic concepts you work with, these kinds of things. And there isn't any relevant question about the morality of the individuals engaged in that process. You can be a great footballer and a real jerk off the pitch, and you can be a great academic and a real jerk, or a saint and be it's not what's not good is if what should be a kind of arena of competition over truth claims, strong arguments, strong reasons for believing certain things and not others, becomes turned into an arena of competition over kind of moral status, who has the right to say certain things, and bases their authority not on this kind of truth claiming process, but more on a kind of inward moral authority. That's deeply problematic for the process.
Yeah,
But
great.
I'm also saying it's fine to do that out in civil society and
Right,
in
right.
other arenas. It's not,
It has its place.
yeah,
Right.
it has its place. It's just that this is a rather delicate system, and it doesn't work well if we're not all playing by the same rules.
Mhm.
You know, and there is a kind of weakening of that idea that we're all playing by the same rules, which has to do with a lot of the conflicts that are happening in the university sector these days around the whole host of things around academic freedom, freedom of speech, you know, trigger warnings, or, you know, I think there's some place where I make a brief reference, but, you know, as Jonathan Hearn puts it, you know, is the mission of the university to pursue truth, or is it to pursue justice? And my view is it's to pursue truth. You know, we're not a particularly qualified bunch to pursue justice. You know, that's not, you know, we're no more moral than anybody else, right? So,
Do you think that, like, do you think some people, because what's the distinction between justice and truth in your mind? Does, like, because to me, truth inevitably leads to a more fair, just society. So where would be the distinction in?
well, I mean, the way you put it there, I mean, truth is, you know, is not the same thing as justice. It's something that you think sort of generates it. I'm not sure that I'm convinced of that. I think, you know, it could well be that some kinds of truth, well, let me set that aside and say, you know, there are lots of different conceptions of justice, and it depends partly on what your conception
Fair
of justice
enough.
is, because part of what we're talking about here is there's a strong notion that justice is the equitable distribution of resources. But of course, there's another concept you find in the philosophical tradition, that justice is giving each according to what's due to them.
Right.
And some may be due a lot because of things they've done, and some may be due very little, right? So those are very, it might be that second conception of justice is a bit more concordant with an idea that truth will lead to justice.
Right. I think that's probably where I was.
Yeah, yeah. Which, you know, there may be some truth to that, but on some level, my view is that apart from allocating rewards for good scholarship, or long service to the institution, the kind of usual things, every complex organization has its internal matters of justice and fairness, right? That it has to live by to make itself work. But I don't think people in universities are particularly well qualified to make proclamations about justice out there in society. I mean, not in the sense that, I don't think there should be moral philosophers and political philosophers who speculate and forth arguments about how we should think about it. But it's not. I do see them as separate things, and our job is to understand the world and how it works, make arguments about what the implications of different ways of doing things might be. But the job of pursuing justice in society, that belongs in the political arena. That's what political parties should be fighting over. That's what in campaigning groups in civil society, and religious organizations. There are all sorts of things that for which can make contending claims about what a just world would look like, and what the principles that for achieving justice might be.
So I guess it's the argument between the appropriate place of conversations of justice being in all places or some places. Because I think you, like you pointed, the sort of those inclined to argue that, well, all places, because of their inherently political nature, should be the places where conversations of justice take place. Whereas you're suggesting that, well, the university should be places of truth pursuit, and that the sort of intelligentsia, so to speak, that are surrounding the academy or academics, the journalists, activists, religious types or religious communities. Those are the conversations where justice is, or politics and
Yeah, I mean, that makes it sound too pristine. It's not like, it'd be very odd to have a university environment where people didn't sometimes talk about what they thought justice was.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to be
But,
so
but,
brute about it.
I mean, the point is not to diverge too far from the core issue, which is that what we do in this particular institution is argue over claims about reality and how the world works, and we get our reputations, authority within that arena from how well people think we're doing that. We don't get it from some sort of, generic claim based on our identities or whatever, to having a certain kind of moral authority, kind of intrinsically, inbuilt in us. That's not, that just distorts the debate, as it were. And it's, it's a complicated thing because as you rightly note, there's a chapter that's about from churches to universities, right? And it's basically kind of arguing that, in a sense, universities occupy the social structural space that church used to occupy as the center of learning, and also the center of a debate about reality and truth. And but the modern university has tended to shed a lot of that moral authority and allow religion and other institutions to hold on to that. And a lot of modern religions have sort of said, oh, science is fine, it can do whatever it wants. That's not what we're concerned about. We're concerned about people's moral lives. And so there's a kind of division of labor that's happened there. But as a huge institution full of people trained to make arguments and claims about the world, it almost naturally becomes the place where people bring in claims to kind of moral authority, because in some sense, it's not exactly that the imprint of the church is still there, but in some sense it requires a lot of stringent sort of self-discipline to kind of keep those things in check in that environment, because professors now have the pulpit, and if you stand up and you have a kind of pulpit, it's very tempting to start telling people how they how they ought to live. There's a structural push towards doing that in the nature of the institution.
What incentive, kind of like
yeah, and people, academics
or temptation might be a better word.
Temptation and natural aspects of ego play in here and stuff. And
John, I'm conscious of the time.
Yeah.
And you said you didn't want to stay long past 5.
Yeah.
So should we?
Yeah, I was about to say.
Was there anything you wanted to say just to finish off about the book or about yourself? Or...
No, I mean, I think I would just say read it, but also it is, although it's much of it is about long historical transformation kind of across the 18th and 19th centuries. It's not written about, apart from the kind of last chapter where I kind of reflect on the present world.
Sure.
It's very historical, but my purpose with the book is also to say, how did this kind of society emerge? There's a tendency to, when you talk about liberalism or liberal society, to talk as though it's the product of liberal thinkers, philosophers, John Stuart Mill or whoever, who kind of dreamed up a certain way of organizing ourselves, and then we've started to run our lives accordingly. But what I'm trying to say is that this peculiar thing that I'm calling liberal society wasn't intended by anyone. It emerged for a whole set of evolutionary reasons. So often, if you're in that kind of society and you think it has value and you want to preserve it, in some sense you're left in the position of, not just, banging a drum and saying, this is what I believe, but saying, look, this is a really complicated thing. It's kind of fragile. It evolved under certain circumstances. Understanding how we got here and what it is that's good about it that we want to preserve, and what's not good and needs to be addressed and changed, is the right attitude. And I'll just close on this weird note that there's something about that is kind of, in terms of thought styles or kind of philosophical traditions, close to a certain kind of, Burkean conservative thought, that you see society as this thing that's very complex, fragile, evolving, and you need to decide what to maintain and what to try and change. But it involves a kind of skepticism about the idea that, oh, it's all terrible, and if we, just did the right thing, we would wipe the slate clean and make the world a better place. Or change is terrible, we need to go back to, some pristine place when the social order was fine. Neither a social evolutionary view implies this kind of prudent, careful, how did we get here? What can we change? That's the attitude of the book. So I'm trying not to be too, I'm not banging on a pulpit. I'm saying, look, this is how we got here.
No, it definitely comes across in the book, mate. So I really enjoyed it. Thank you, John.
Let's show it again.
One more time.
There we go. Together. All together now.
Awesome. Well, John, thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone at home for watching, and we'll see you next time. Take care of yourselves.